I want you to think about the last news notification you got on your phone. Just picture it, sitting there on your lock screen.
Oh, yeah, we get dozens of those a day.
Right. And if that alert said, police officer shoots suspect, you instantly have a very clear picture in your mind of what happened. There is a subject, a verb, and an object.
Exactly. It's incredibly direct.
But if that exact same alert said, suspect fatally injured in officer-involved shooting, the picture is completely muddied. I mean, the facts of the event are identical.
Yeah, the outcome hasn't changed at all.
Right. But the grammar is doing this massive, invisible, heavy lifting. It just removes the direct action, obscures the actor, and completely changes how your brain processes the reality of that event.
It totally does. It creates this linguistic distance between the action and the responsibility. And we consume this kind of language every single day, usually without ever really stopping to map out the architecture of the sentence.
We just read for the who and the what.
Right, but we almost never read for the how.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are going to introduce you to a concept that might honestly completely rewire how you consume media.
It definitely rewired it for me.
Same here. We're exploring the idea that the most insidious bias in journalism isn't always what is being said. It's not, the loud shouting punditry on cable news.
No, it's way more subtle than that.
It is the invisible architecture of the sentence itself. And to do this, we are unpacking an incredibly rigorous, totally fascinating chat log provided to us by someone we are going to refer to simply as the investigator.
And we really have to give credit to the investigator here, because they undertook a truly monumental project.
They really did. And to quote them directly on their goal for this, they told us, expose BBC to the world. This is my chat with an AI about the BBC channel's video titles bias. I try to be as vigorous and precise as I could, and now you would do that same at understanding this and present it fairly back to the world. Refer me as the investigator.
Which is just a brilliant mission statement. They wanted to expose potential bias in the BBC's video titles, specifically on YouTube.
So what they did is they fed an artificial intelligence a massive data set. We're talking tens of thousands of titles scanning real and projected geopolitical events up to the year 2026.
But what makes this project so compelling isn't just the data, it's the methodology, because the investigator didn't just ask the AI, hey, is the BBC biased?
Right, that would be too simple.
Exactly. They relentlessly forced the AI to look past surface-level metrics like, how many times a certain keyword appeared. They demanded that it examine the underlying linguistic structures.
It is an absolute masterclass in critical thinking, just forcing a machine to evaluate language at a granular structural level.
It really is.
Now, real quick, because we are dealing with intense ongoing geopolitical conflicts today involving the U.S., Iran, Israel, Russia, Ukraine, and so on, it is vital that we establish what we are not doing today.
Very important point.
We are not here to litigate these conflicts. We're not here to tell you who the good guys or the bad guys are. We're taking absolutely no sides in this deep dive. Zero.
None at all. Our focus is purely on the math of the English language.
Yes, the math of the language.
We are strictly reporting the investigator's linguistic data and analyzing the BBC's editorial framing mechanics, exactly as they are contained and debated in the source document.
We are putting verbs, nouns, active voice, and passive voice under a microscope to see how reality is constructed for the reader.
So here is our roadmap. We're going to unpack the investigator's methodology, explore this brilliant concept they call institutional glamour, and look at how the BBC handles different global actors.
And we'll detail the intense philosophical debate that actually breaks out between the investigator and the AI over what constitutes bias.
Oh yeah, that showdown is incredible.
It really is. And finally, we'll reveal the professional journalistic verdict this investigation actually produced.
So let's start with the sheer scale of the data set. We are talking about exactly 26,905 BBC video titles.
Wow. That is just a staggering amount of language data.
It really is. To put that in perspective, if you were to read one headline every 10 seconds, it would take you roughly 3 straight days without sleeping at all to get through that list.
That's exhausting just to think about.
Right. And when you give an AI a data set that massive and tell it to look for bias in Western media, it naturally gravitates toward the most visible, high-frequency subjects of the last decade.
Well, it would be Donald Trump.
Naturally. The AI basically assumed that if it was going to find bias, it should look at how much the BBC talks about Trump.
It's the most common trap people fall into when analyzing media. They just equate volume with bias.
Exactly. It's the easiest metric to pull. You just hit Sriel F, type in the name, and count the results.
And that's exactly what the AI did at first, right?
Yep. It ran the numbers and found that Trump appears in 1,968 titles out of the 26,905.
Okay, so that comes out to what? Roughly 7.3% of the total BBC file?
That's right. And to give that context, the AI pulled control files from other major American networks. Fox News featured Trump in about 18.9% of their titles.
Oh, wow, so way higher.
Yeah. CNN was at 10.4% and NBC was at 10.8%.
Wait, hold on. If the BBC is mentioning Trump significantly less than Fox and noticeably less than CNN and NBC, wouldn't a basic reading of that suggest they're actually being more neutral?
That's the logical conclusion if you're just counting.
Right. I mean, if volume equals bias and their volume is lower, the AI must have thought there was no bias there at all. Where is the bias?
That is precisely the trap the AI fell into. It looked at that 7.3%, compared it to the American networks, and basically concluded that the BBC was exercising remarkable restraint.
Interesting.
But this is where the investigator steps in and completely changes the parameters of the experiment.
I love this part.
They told the AI, in no uncertain terms, to stop acting like a basic keyword counter. The investigator argued that bias isn't found in the volume of the word Trump. It is found in his function within the sentence structure.
Function over volume. So instead of asking how often he is mentioned, they're asking what he's doing when he is mentioned.
Exactly. And when the AI recalibrated to look at grammatical function, a completely different picture emerged.
What did it find?
Well, quoting directly from the source data, the AI realized that the BBC often makes Trump the quoted source or speech actor.
So it's not just that his name is present, it's the structural role he plays in the narrative of the headline.
Yes. Let's pull a specific example from the text to make this concrete, because this is where the linguistic analysis gets so fascinating.
Okay, lay it on me.
Here is one of the headlines from the dataset. Trump claims deal to end Iran war near, but Tehran says nothing finalized.
Okay, Trump claims deal to end Iran war near, but Tehran says nothing finalized. So if we break down the syntax tree of that sentence, we have to ask, who is setting the agenda here?
Right. Who is driving the narrative?
Well, Trump is the primary actor. He's the subject of the independent clause. He claims a deal is near. He establishes the entire premise of the sentence before we even get to the comma.
He really does. And look at the second half. But Tehran says nothing finalized.
Right.
Even though that second half corrects him or, offers a counter-narrative, Trump still owns what media theorists call the headline layer.
The headline layer. I like that term.
He establishes the initial reality. The adversary, in this case, Tehran, is relegated entirely to the reaction.
I see. They are not proposing a reality. They are merely responding to his established premise.
Exactly.
I see what you mean. It's like if I tell you the expert claims the sky is green, but scientists say it's blue.
Right.
The conversation is now entirely centered around your absurd claim about the sky. The scientists are just there to clean up the mess you made. You dictated the terms of the conversation.
That is a perfect analogy. You gave me incredible agenda-setting power simply by making me the subject of the sentence. And so the AI concluded that the BBC's linguistic structure wasn't simply pro-Trump or anti-Trump in a traditional sense. Rather, the BBC was utilizing Trump as a high-frequency agenda-setting source.
His framing received repeated structural access to the dominant position in the headline layer.
Yes. The article itself might spend 2,000 words debunking his claim, but the grammatical architecture of the title handed him the microphone first.
Which is incredibly important considering the reality of how we all consume media. I mean, let's be real. Most of us are scrolling quickly.
We're just skimming.
Exactly. We are reading titles while waiting in line for coffee. The headline is the news for the vast majority of people.
Absolutely is.
If one actor is constantly serving the tennis ball and the other actor is perpetually stuck at the baseline just trying to return it, the server controls the entire pace and direction of the match.
This realization that the functional role of words dictates reality far more than their mere frequency is the major turning point in this chat log.
It's huge.
It allows the investigator to push the AI past basic counting and uncover the BBC's true mechanism of bias. And the investigator labels this mechanism institutional grammar.
Institutional grammar. That is an imposing phrase.
It is, but it captures something profound.
The investigator makes it very clear that this isn't the loud, pundit-driven bias we're all so used to complaining about.
Right, you aren't going to see headlines with 3 exclamation points and, like, emotionally loaded adjectives.
No, the BBC's house style is famously polished, calm, and seemingly objective. It sounds very authoritative.
Highly authoritative. But the investigator demonstrates that this institutional tone actually masks a highly specific type of bias.
And how does that bias operate?
It operates through credibility allocation.
Credibility allocation. Let's go back to that sandwich analogy I mentioned earlier, but really flesh it out.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say my roommate, Dave, ate my sandwich out of the fridge. If I want to report that event, I could use direct active grammar. Dave ate my sandwich.
Very clear.
The subject is Dave. The verb is ate. The object is my sandwich. Concrete fact.
That is what we call clean agency.
Clean agency, right. But if I want to use institutional grammar, I might say, the sandwich was consumed amid allegations of roommate hunger.
That is brilliant. The facts haven't technically changed. I mean, the sandwich is gone and Dave is involved.
Yep.
But the linguistic structure has completely altered the allocation of credibility. By moving the sandwich to the subject position and using the passive verb phrase was consumed, you've completely removed the perpetrator from the primary action.
Dave is no longer the one doing the eating, grammatically speaking.
Exactly. And his action is quarantined behind the word allegations.
It sounds incredibly official. It sounds objective. But it actually muddies the reality of the stolen lunch. One statement is a concrete fact, and the other is a quarantined claim.
And that quarantining is what the investigator brilliantly identifies as epistemic inequality.
Epistemic inequality. Okay, let's break that down for the listener.
Sure. So epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. It's about how we know what is true and how truth is validated.
Right.
So epistemic inequality means there's a fundamental imbalance in how truth is established within the text itself.
Oh, I see.
The investigator forces the AI to map how the BBC uses causal clauses, source hierarchies, and specific procedural terminology to grant certain actors causal legitimacy.
While denying it to others.
Exactly.
When you say procedural terminology, you mean words that imply a rational, managed process. Like, the data show the BBC relies heavily on words like deal, ceasefire, blockade strategy, talks, and self-defense.
Think about the semiotics of those words,
Yeah.
They imply that the actors involved are statesmen.
They are rational managers of complex situations.
Yes, they are granted the legitimacy of having a valid rationale for their action.
And to really see this institutional grammar at work, the investigator instructed the AI to group the tens of thousands of headlines into specific event clusters.
Because they wanted to see if this grammatical framing remained consistent or if it shifted depending on who the actors were.
They didn't just look at one isolated topic. They went searching for a broader, systemic pattern across all global events. Let's dig into some of these specific clusters because, honestly, the differences are staggering.
They really are.
The first one the AI analyzed was the Brexit and UK-EU politics cluster, which contained 913 titles.
Right. Now, Brexit was arguably one of the most emotional, divisive, and economically volatile issues in modern British history.
Oh, totally.
So you might expect the language surrounding it to reflect that volatility.
You would think so.
But the AI found something completely different. The BBC framed Brexit almost entirely neutrally as a Westminster-centered procedural issue.
Wait, what does that actually look like in practice?
It means there was a distinct structural lack of moral threat language. The verbs were strictly administrative.
Like what?
A headline might read, "Is the UK worse off because of Brexit?" Or "Parliament debates withdrawal agreement?"
Wow. So despite the massive social upheaval it caused, the institutional grammar framed it as a constitutional management problem.
Exactly. It was a debate among politicians in suits, rather than a narrative populated by villains and aggressors. It's totally sanitized through procedure.
Then, the AI shifted its focus to the Hong Kong and China cluster, which contained 886 titles.
And here, the linguistic architecture changed dramatically.
How so?
The AI detected a clear, systemic, pro-democracy framing that centered heavily on the protesters. The grammar frequently adopted the protesters' language and perspective.
Giving them the dominant role.
Yes, granting them the dominant subject role and utilizing active verbs to describe the resistance.
The causal legitimacy was granted to the protesters. Their actions were framed as natural responses to an authoritarian threat, rather than being quarantined as alleged unrest or something.
Which is a very sharp contrast to how the AI analyzed the COVID cluster.
Oh yeah, the COVID cluster. That one had 1,429 titles.
Right. This cluster leaned heavily on institutional public health framing initially, and then later shifted into accountability framing.
This is very procedural.
Highly procedural. It relied on experts, official data, and government mandates as the unquestioned baseline of reality.
To make it to the Israel-Gaza cluster, which had 1,064 titles. This is where the epistemic inequality really starts to become visible.
It does. The AI noted that the framing in this cluster was mixed, but a highly significant recurring pattern emerged regarding who was granted that procedural terminology we discussed earlier.
Right.
Israel frequently received state or security framing. The verbs associated with their actions were tied to words like strategy, response, or defense.
So they are linguistically positioned as the rational managers of the conflict.
Conversely, the AI found that Palestinian suffering was frequently humanitarianized or, crucially, sourced to third parties.
So instead of a direct declarative statement of an event, the action would be quarantined through attribution to medics, local ministries, or the UN. So you have one side whose actions are structurally presented as managed statecraft, and another side whose reality is structurally presented either as passive suffering or as claims that require third-party verification to even be mentioned.
That's the asymmetry right there.
You can really start to see the shape of this institutional grammar. It is not static. It flexes and adapts depending on who the actors are.
It absolutely does. It assigns varying levels of directness and legitimacy.
But this is where the analytical rigor of the chat log reaches a whole new level, because the AI, acting as a proxy for traditional media defense, attempts to explain away these discrepancies.
Oh yeah, the AI pushes back hard. It argues that perhaps the BBC simply has a very strict, legally mandated style guide.
Which sounds reasonable.
It suggests that as a massive taxpayer-funded institution, the BBC is basically forced to use passive, bureaucratic, highly cautious language for everything involving kinetic conflict.
And look, I've read enough news to know that newsrooms have massive manuals dictating exactly how to refer to everything from a car crash to a war zone. It's a very logical defense.
It is.
You could easily argue, hey, they aren't biased, they're just incredibly boring, overly cautious writers who are terrified of getting sued.
It is the ultimate shield for any large institution. We aren't biased, we are just bureaucratic.
Right.
But to test this hypothesis, the investigator does something brilliant.
What do?
They don't argue with the AI's logic, they accept it, and then they introduce a control group to break it.
Wow, the scientific method applied to journalism, I love it.
Exactly. If the BBC always uses passive, cautious, bureaucratic language because of a strict style guide, then that grammatical structure should apply uniformly to everyone, regardless of geopolitical alignment.
That makes total sense. So the investigator directs the AI to analyze the Russia-Ukraine cluster.
Yes, and this is the largest data set they looked at. It contained a massive 2,543 titles.
Okay, so if the BBC is forced to use passive language by their own internal rulebook, we should expect to see headlines like, "Explosions reported in Kyiv amid allegations of Russian involvement," or "Projectiles strike energy grid as Ukraine claims Kremlin aggression."
The action should be distanced and the actor should be quarantined.
Exactly.
But that is emphatically not what the data shows. The investigator uses this Russia cluster to completely dismantle the style guide defense.
How so?
When the AI parsed the syntax trees of these 2,500 titles, it found that the BBC is perfectly capable of writing with absolute, unmitigated, clean agency when the adversary is Russia.
Clean agency, meaning there is no linguistic distance. They directly state who did what to whom.
Yes. Let's read some direct quotes from the raw data dump to illustrate this, because hearing the verbs back-to-back is just striking.
Listener, pay close attention to the verbs in these BBC headlines. Here's number 1, how Russia turns Ukrainians into spies.
Number 2, massive Russian attack on cities across Ukraine kills at least 13 people.
Number 3, Russian drone hits Romanian apartment block.
And number 4, Russian warship fires warning shots near boat off UK coast.
Let's do an in-depth morphological and syntactic analysis of those verbs. Turns, kills, hits, fires. These are concrete, declarative, highly active verbs.
They are. In every single one of those sentences, Russia is the undeniable subject, and they are performing a direct hostile action against an object.
There is no amid allegations anywhere in there.
Nope.
There is no projectiles reportedly struck an apartment block. It is Russian drone hits. The BBC didn't wait for a third-party UN verification to state it as a fact.
This is a devastating finding for the AI's initial defense. It proves mathematically that the BBC house style clearly does not prevent direct hostile agency.
They do not have an overriding institutional rule against saying country X killed people or country Y fired a weapon.
The linguistic capability for directness exists within the organization.
Therefore, if that direct agency and causal justification are missing elsewhere in their reporting, if it is replaced by passive voice and quarantine claims in other conflicts, it is not because of a blanket stylistic rule.
Exactly. It's because that agency is distributed unevenly, largely mapping onto geopolitical alignment.
The BBC can point the finger clearly and declaratively when they choose to.
They absolutely can. And having firmly established that the BBC is capable of clean agency, the investigator then turns the AI's attention to the absolute center of the bullseye.
They direct it to look at the most glaring, undeniable asymmetry in the entire 26,000 headline dataset.
Which brings us to the core finding of the investigation: the U.S.-Iran and Strait of Hormuz cluster.
In this specific cluster of 846 titles, the AI, guided by the investigators' newly established parameters for grammar and agency, uncovers a massive systemic asymmetric credibility allocation.
This is where the concept of epistemic inequality stops being an academic theory and becomes a measurable reality.
We really need to look closely at the illustrative content from the chat log here.
Yes, the raw data provides specific pairs of headlines that show how the BBC treats the exact same type of kinetic military action. Missiles being fired, ships being hit, planes attacking completely differently depending on whose military is pulling the trigger.
Let's read these pairs and compare them. We'll start with how the BBC frames declarative U.S. actions. In the linguistic structure of these titles, U.S. actions are written as established event facts.
Okay, here's example A, breaking. U.S. launches new strikes on Iran after attack on cargo ship.
Example B, U.S. strikes Iran in response to downing of military helicopter.
And example C, U.S. fighter jet attacks Iranian oil tanker.
Now compare those grammatical structures to how the BBC handles mediated or agentless Iranian actions. In these titles, the actions are quarantined as claims or threats.
Example A, cargo ship struck by projectile in Strait of Hormuz as U.S. insists ceasefire holding.
Example B, Iran and U.S. exchange fire in Strait of Hormuz. Iran accuses U.S. of violating ceasefire.
And example C, Iran fires multiple missiles at Israel in new threat to ceasefire.
Let's break down the linguistic effect here, because when you put them side by side, the disparity is just staggering.
Look at the syntax of the first group. Western U.S. or Israeli actions are written declaratively. U.S. launches, U.S. strikes, U.S. fighter jet attacks.
The subject is clear, the active verb is clear. They are established facts.
But crucially, look at how they are justified within the sentence itself. They are often framed with a causal rationale built right into the headline layer.
They are a response to something, or they happen after an attack?
Exactly. They possess causal legitimacy. The grammar inherently argues that the U.S. is only using violence defensively as a necessary reaction to someone else's provocation.
But look at the second group. When Iranian or Hezbollah-linked forces take kinetic action, the grammar undergoes a complete transformation.
It frequently becomes entirely agentless. Cargo ship struck by projectile.
Right. Who fired the projectile? The headline refuses to say.
The action is mediated. The violence just sort of, happens. It's like weather.
And when Iran is allowed to be the subject of the sentence, their rationale is aggressively quarantined. It is hidden behind words like claims, accuses, or framed explicitly as a threat.
Listen to the phrasing. Iran accuses U.S. of violating ceasefire. New threat to ceasefire.
This is the epistemic inequality in its purest form.
It really is.
The U.S. military actions are treated by the grammar as objective reality. They are managed responses to global chaos.
While the Iranian actions are treated either as unverified claims that cannot be stated as fact or as irrational, unprovoked aggression.
The BBC is acting as an epistemic gatekeeper here. They're deciding whose truth gets to be stated as a concrete event fact in the independent clause, and whose truth gets quarantined as an allegation in a dependent clause.
Let's speculate on the cognitive impact of this for a moment.
Oh, let's do it.
Imagine consuming this specific linguistic architecture day after day, year after year, on your YouTube feed or your Apple News app or your television. What does this subtly train the human brain to do?
It trains the reader to view the world through a deeply entrenched hierarchical lens. You begin to subconsciously view one side, the U.S., the U.K., Israel, the West, as the rational adults in the room.
Exactly. They are the managers of the conflict. They only utilize violence as a measured response or a procedural strategy to restore order.
While the other side, Iran, Hezbollah, and other adversaries, depending on the specific cluster, are structurally framed as irrational, unverified aggressors.
Their violence is always a threat, an escalation, or an unproven claim. You almost never see their violence framed as a response or self-defense in that crucial headline layer.
Right. Even if, chronologically, an Iranian strike is technically a direct retaliation for a previous U.S. strike that happened yesterday, the BBC headline will likely frame the initial U.S. strike as a response to a broader issue, and the subsequent Iranian strike is a new threat.
It is an invisible narrative architecture, and it completely shapes how the public understands the morality, causality, and sequence of global conflicts.
It's mind-blowing when you see it mathematically laid out in the syntax trees. You really cannot unsee it.
You really can't. But here is where the chat log turns into an absolute intellectual thriller.
Oh, this is the best part.
Just when the investigator has the data completely cornered, the AI attempts one final massive backpedal. It tries to wiggle out of the unavoidable conclusion.
Which makes sense. I mean, the AI is likely heavily programmed with guardrails to avoid accusing major, reputable news organizations of systemic bias. It's designed to be cautious.
Yeah, so it literally role-plays a defense. It simulates pushback, telling the investigator, hey, I submitted your report to a simulated professor of political linguistics and a senior editor at the BBC, and they both reject your conclusion.
Wow.
The AI attempts to argue that these grammatical patterns aren't evidence of systemic bias at all. It claims they are merely the practical, unavoidable result of standard wire service grammar, character length limits on YouTube, and the harsh realities of verification-driven journalism in an asymmetric conflict environment.
Okay, let me actually jump in here and defend the AI for a second, because that defense sounds incredibly robust.
All right, devil's advocate, let's hear it.
If the U.S. Central Command puts out an official press release stating, "We struck this target in Yemen today," it is incredibly easy for a BBC desk editor in London to verify that fact. The U.S. is putting their official seal on it. But if a random drone hits a commercial cargo ship in the middle of the night in the Gulf of Oman, it might be literally impossible to know exactly who fired it in the first 20 minutes when the breaking news alert needs to go out.
Sure, fog of war.
Right. So isn't the AI completely right to argue that the BBC is just adhering to basic journalistic verification standards by using cautious, agentless language in those chaotic moments?
It is the strongest, most sophisticated defense the AI mounts in the entire chat log. It argues that the BBC rightfully requires a much higher evidentiary burden of proof to assign direct agency to actors in chaotic fog of war environments.
Exactly.
But the investigator is absolutely fierce in their rebuttal. They refuse to let the AI weaken the conclusion based on this operational excuse.
So how do they dismantle it? Because we were just waiting for verification is the gold standard defense for every newsroom on Earth.
The investigator points out a massive fundamental logical flaw in the AI's retreat. The AI is conflating two completely different concepts. It is confusing not proven intent with not proven bias.
Oh, wow. That is a crucial philosophical distinction. Let's dig into that.
Let me quote the investigator's vigorous argument directly from the chat log. They write, "Structural bias usually does not require proof of conscious intent. It appears in repeated editorial outcomes who becomes the subject, who becomes the object, whose statements become event reality, whose statements remain claims."
Wow. Okay, so the investigator is saying that you don't need a smoking gun.
Right. You don't need an intercepted email from a BBC executive saying, hey, everyone, make sure we use passive voice for Iran today to make them look bad.
Exactly. You do not need to prove that a BBC editor rubbed their hands together in a dark room and maliciously plotted a propaganda campaign.
You don't even need to know why the editor chose those specific words.
If the published output, the actual 26,000 headlines consumed by millions of people, systematically privileges one geopolitical actor's credibility over another's, that is bias at the headline level.
The mechanism, meaning why it happened, whether it was a strict style guide, a 60-character YouTube limit, or an unconscious institutional reliance on Western military press releases over local sources, is a completely separate question from the existence, meaning that it is happening.
Think about it like a physical scale in a laboratory.
Okay.
If a scale consistently weighs items heavily to one side, the scale is biased.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's tipped because the manufacturer is evil and rigged it, or because a heavy speck of dust landed on the mechanism, or because the table it's sitting on is slanted.
The output is a biased measurement.
Exactly. The investigator brilliantly forces the AI to separate the cause of the linguistic disparity from the undeniable effect it produces.
And the effect is undeniable in the data. The BBC's supposedly neutral journalistic conventions reliably produce a strict, recognizable geopolitical hierarchy in their published titles.
If U.S. actions are easily stabilized as concrete facts, and adversary actions are constantly mediated, delayed, or rendered entirely agentless, the headline output is structurally biased. Period.
The excuse doesn't change the mathematical reality of the text.
So what does the AI do?
Forced to accept this airtight, irrefutable logic, the AI finally yields. It accepts the correction from the investigator. It agrees that the title file establishes a recurring asymmetry in headline grammar that constitutes a definitive headline-level framing bias.
Which brings us to the climax of this deep dive.
Mm.
Because the investigator doesn't just want an academic victory over a chatbot.
No, they want to know what this actually means in the real world of media criticism. They want to produce a document that exposes this dynamic clearly.
So what's their next move?
The investigator forces the AI to act as a professional investigative journalist preparing an actual expose for publication. They tell the AI to stress test the findings, what can and cannot be published under severe legal and editorial challenge.
Oh, that's smart.
If the BBC were to sue or publicly attack this report, what specific claims would hold up in a court of law or a journalistic review board?
This is such a rigorous constraint. It completely stops the AI from making overly broad, easily dismissed claims like, the BBC hates Iran, and hones the conclusion down to a razor-sharp, mathematically defensible critique.
Exactly. So the AI details a highly precise final verdict. First, let's look at what cannot be published based solely on this data set, because it's important to understand the limits of the data.
Right. What did the AI say would be thrown out by a legal team?
The AI determined that you cannot publish a hard expose accusing the BBC of being a deliberate institutional propaganda machine that intentionally launders state narratives. The title file alone cannot prove bad faith, conscious conspiracy, or malicious intent on the part of individual editors.
Because, as we just discussed, we only have the output. We don't have the intent. Claiming intentional propaganda would require internal memos, whistleblowers, or direct confessions.
Correct. Making those claims would be legally and journalistically reckless without further internal evidence. But the AI outlines exactly what can be published, and the defensible conclusion is still incredibly damning. You can publish a rigorous, data-driven headline framing critique based entirely on the structural reality of the text.
Let's read the AI's final, heavily stress-tested, utterly defensible conclusion.
Go for it.
Listen to how precise, how stripped of emotion, and yet how devastating this linguistic verdict is. BBC YouTube titles in the audited crisis clusters show a recurring asymmetry in agency, attribution, causal framing, and evidentiary burden. U.S. and Israeli actions are more often presented as declarative or responsive, while Iranian and Hezbollah link actions are more often framed through attribution, accusation, warning, threat language, denial, or agentless phrasing.
It is a stunning verdict.
It really is.
And it is bulletproof because it relies entirely on the measurable data of the syntax. It doesn't guess at the internal motives of a desk editor in London. It simply maps the structural, grammatical reality of the BBC's language and points out the glaring disparity.
I really have to commend the investigator here. By being so vigorous, so relentlessly precise, and refusing to let the AI off the hook with easy, traditional excuses about journalistic verification, they didn't just find bias.
Anyone can yell bias on a social media platform.
Exactly. The investigator defined the exact, granular parameters of how bias operates grammatically and how it can be responsibly and irrefutably reported to the public.
They elevated the entire conversation. They moved it from the subjective, emotional feeling of the media is unfair to my side, to an objective structural analysis of epistemic inequality.
They proved that the grammar itself, the very placement of the verbs and nouns, is doing the heavy lifting of narrative control.
Okay, let's take a breath and recap the incredible intellectual journey the investigator took us on.
Sounds good. We started by looking at the most basic, flawed metric of media criticism, simple keyword counts. The idea that whoever is mentioned the most, like the nearly 2,000 Trump headlines, is the primary target of bias.
But we learned that volume is a myth. The real power lies in grammatical function. It's about agenda-setting power within the headline layer.
We then uncovered the invisible, insidious power of institutional grammar and epistemic inequality. We saw how the BBC utilizes causal clauses, passive voice, and procedural terms to grant inherent legitimacy to certain actors, as we saw in the sanitized framing of the Brexit cluster, or the state-centric framing of Israel.
And we use the massive Russia-Ukraine dataset as a scientific control group to definitively prove that the BBC is perfectly capable of using active, concrete, declarative verbs, kills, hits, fires when it chooses to, utterly destroying the defense that they are simply bound by a cautious, bureaucratic style guide.
And then we found the glaring, undeniable asymmetry in the U.S.-Iran and Hormuz cluster. Declarative U.S. event facts with causal legitimacy contrasted sharply against mediated, agentless Iranian claims and threats.
Which led to the epic philosophical showdown over intent versus output, proving that you don't need a malicious conspiracy in a newsroom to produce a structurally biased, geopolitically hierarchical output.
Leading, finally, to that bulletproof journalistic verdict that exposes the BBC's framing mechanics to the world.
This has been a deeply analytical, heavily linguistic deep dive.
It has.
Yeah.
But I want to connect this directly back to you, the listener, right now. Why should you care about syntax trees, causal clauses, and epistemic inequality in your daily life?
Because you are swimming in this language every single day. It is the water you breathe.
Exactly. The next time you are scrolling through YouTube or glancing at your news feed or reading a breaking news alert on your lock screen, I challenge you to not just look at what the headline says, but to dissect how it is built.
Become your own investigator.
Look at the sentence architecture. Ask yourself, who is the subject? Who is the object? Whose violence is structurally framed as a necessary response, and whose violence is framed as an unprovoked threat? Who gets to state a concrete fact, and who is stuck indefinitely making an allegation?
Once you see the invisible matrix of institutional grammar, you can never unsee it.
It is the ultimate tool for media literacy. It empowers you as a reader to strip away the structural framing, recognize who is trying to allocate credibility, and evaluate the raw events for yourself.
But I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought.
Something to mull over on your drive home or while you're making dinner or walking the dog.
We've spent this entire time analyzing how a massive global news organization uses institutional grammar to allocate credibility and shape the reality of millions of people.
But how does this exact same institutional grammar exist in our own personal lives?
That is a fascinating psychological question.
Think about it. Think about the last time you had a serious dispute at work or a difficult argument with a partner or a close friend. When you later recounted that story to someone else, when you were the editor of that narrative, how did you frame it?
Oh, wow.
Did you intuitively frame your own actions as declarative, justified responses to a chaotic situation? Like, I only raise my voice in response to their blatant disrespect.
And did you frame their actions as unverified claims or irrational threats? They claimed I was ignoring them and then threatened to leave.
We all do it instinctively. We are the executive editors of our own personal narratives. We naturally grant ourselves causal legitimacy, and we grammatically quarantine the actions and feelings of those we're in conflict with.
We do. We all use epistemic inequality to make ourselves the rational statesmen managing the crisis of our own lives while painting others as the irrational aggressors.
So the ultimate question is, if we all act as the BBC of our own lives, constantly spinning our own institutional grammar to protect our own narrative, how can we ever truly understand the other side's story?
Just like with consuming the news, maybe the only way to find the actual truth in our own relationships is to stop yelling about the volume of the argument and start rigorously examining the grammar of how we tell the story.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.